Hey everybody. Games are hard, and the reason is because they have a lot of problems that other kinds of software doesn't have. So even if you study software architecture, you're likely to find that it doesn't have many solutions for the kinds of issues that games have. In my mind, the biggest problem with game dev is scoping, and I don't mean how many features it has. That's a problem with all kinds of software. I mean the technical term scope. Is something in scope? Is it out of scope? Is it being overwritten? So these concerns are at the heart of nearly every game dev challenge I've ever faced. You can always look up something like how to render 10,000 polygons a frame, but you can't look up something like how do I find the dang player? So let's go ahead and talk about some very basic and common problems, starting with the very, very simplest one. How do you find and track things? So here's a scene, and the player walks into the scene, and you want to light them on fire, so they're like, oh gosh, I better finish this scene fast, or I will die. So you create a little invisible object, which is called light fire. And it can light anything on fire, you just have to point to whatever you're lighting on fire. But how do you point to the player? The player is not from this scene. The player walked in from some other scene. When you're designing this scene, you can't drag the player onto this light fire object because the player isn't here. How do you refer to the player? Well, this is not a hard problem, and everybody does it basically the same way. You use a static variable. So on the player class, you would have a public static player live. And when the player turns on, it signs up and says, I'm the live player. And when the player turns off, it says, okay, I'm no longer the live player. This is an easy, fast, and flexible solution. Even if you've got multiple avatars and the player can switch between them, each time you switch avatars, you just switch who's live, so you can track which avatar the player is currently controlling and light the right one on fire. And then obviously you have to program light fire to actually grab this value. You can't just magically have that passed in correctly, but you can do that. That's just one line of code. That's not too hard. There are also a lot of times when you're going to want to track enemies. For example, this door opens when all of the enemies are dead. Now, one option is that you could have this door contain a list of enemies to check. And then when you create the door, you drag the enemies into the list and it checks every frame and says, okay, well, is this enemy dead? Is this enemy dead? Is this enemy dead? The problem is that that is making something entangled. You are creating a lot of complexity where you don't need complexity. And this is a scoping issue. Just like the player is out of scope of the scene, these enemies should be brought into the correct scope in order for you to use them correctly. This is passing variables in as arguments, essentially. But that's not really what we want here, because this scene is one scope. What we would like is for the enemies that are in the scene to be in scope with the door. It's just a basic setup. You want the door to be able to say, hey, are there any enemies? You don't want the door to have to manually get set up every single time you create a door in every scene in your game. That would be a nightmare. And the answer is the same. On the enemies class, you create a static list. And this just tracks all of the enemies that are alive. So when the enemies turn on, they add themselves to the list. When they die, they take themselves off the list. And now the door can just check whether or not there is any enemy.live. And if there isn't, it can unlock itself. These are the same solutions, and they do the same thing. They take something that would be annoying to do, either because it's too local or too global, and they put it into the right scope. Now, with that in mind, let's move on to something a little more complicated, responding. We want the door to open when the enemies die. So how do we set that up? How do we make it so that the door opens when the enemies die? Well, one option is to have a script, a class, that's like, well, when the door, every frame, check if there are live enemies. And if there are no live enemies, open the door. Pretty straightforward. Also, extremely fragile. If you use that approach, then unless you never plan to do anything else with your enemies or your doors, it's going to be really obnoxious to try and wedge your fingers in and make it do something else. So when you're trying to create a response system like this, you want to put the responses in the correct scope. Now, if you hard-code a response, then that is hard-coded to a global scope. But this scene has its own scene logic, and you should be able to set it up in the scene, which is not global scope. So what you want to do is you want to make your responder surface something that can be used in any scope you'd like, depending on what you need. So let's go ahead and talk about an easy way to do that. We have an object. We add a new mono behavior to this door, and the new mono behavior is called an enemy dead responder. Right? And it doesn't do anything specific when it detects that all the enemies are dead. Instead, it just fires a Unity event. Unity events are extremely powerful methods to give you access to every scoping level that you need at every moment that you might need it. So this Unity event will fire. All you have to do is here in the scene view, drag the door into this Unity event and then have it open the door so that when all of the enemies are dead, this enemy dead responder fires the door.open function and the door opens. That's extremely basic and extremely simple. It does the same thing as the hard-coded method, but it can also do other things, as we'll talk about very shortly here. This is also a powerful solution because this door can be saved as a prefab and then put into other scenes, and you don't have to keep rewiring it every time because the scope was kept correct. The door is only related to other things that are door-related. There's no references to the enemies outside the door because those have been put into the correct scope using our static variable, our global variable. So because of this, we have the ability to duplicate this door without any additional work. We also have the ability to create amazing new scenes without any additional work. So what happens if we want this to be a tutorial level, and the basic idea is that after we kill these enemies that are safely down in the pit, it goes and now we have to face these 3 enemies before the door unlocks. So in order to have that happen, what kind of coding would we need? Well, we wouldn't need any coding. All we would need to do is put an enemy responder somewhere, it doesn't matter where, and this enemy dead responder will fire an event that moves over the that layer and reveals the new enemies and turns on the door, so the door can respond the next time. And that doesn't require any additional code. It might require someone to create an animation, but that's another topic. So without creating any additional code, we've allowed people to create levels that have waves, and really complicated, interesting waves built right into them, because we're allowing the devs to respond locally to local events, rather than hard coding everything so that everything has to have this global response system that gets messier and messier and messier and messier. So when you use a Unity event to respond to things, you can have that set up locally, globally, or as a prefab, or even local and overriding a prefab. All of those are possible, and those are very powerful tools to let you scope things as you need to scope things and not accidentally get tangled up with too much spaghetti code, too much global spaghetti code. Let's talk about containing and listing things. Obviously, we've already talked about creating a list of enemies. That is one method of containing and listing things, but let's talk about the idea of these zombies in the first place, right? What if we wanted these to be random weak enemies? Well, normally what you would do is you'd create an enemy spawner, and then you'd have a list of possibles. And when the enemy spawner activates, it picks a random element from that list and puts it in the game. This is a problem, because what you've done is you've created 2 very different scopes and you've tied them together. You've hardwired something that shouldn't be hardwired. What am I talking about? Well, this here is a data object, and this here is a logic object. If your logic object contains your data object, that's a potential weakness, vice versa as well. In general, what you want to do is you want to relate them using references if you can. So, for example, the possibles should be its own category. So what we've got is we've got a class called an enemy spawner. And then we've got another class which is called an enemy list. The enemy spawner can point to any enemy list. So that means that you could have a weak enemies prefab, or a weak enemies list as a prefab or as a scriptable object, and it lists all your weak enemies. And you could have the enemy spawner point to that. And that means that as you edit these enemies and delete from the list and add to the list, they automatically get added to all enemy spawners throughout. But if you don't want that weak enemies list to just be a global enemies list, you can also have a local enemy list on the same object and point to that. And because of this flexibility, you have a lot of ability to make sure that you are referring to whatever data set you need to be referring to, regardless of what scope it's in. Moreover, since you can make these enemy spawners into prefabs, you can actually have this enemy list also be something where if you change it, it automatically updates hundreds and hundreds of prefabs and hundreds of scenes. So you got to think a little bit about what scope do you want this enemy list to be? Do you want it to be global scope? Do you want it to be prefab scope? Do you want it to be local scope? Do you want it to be local and overwritten, so it's a prefab with a tweak? Those are all possible in Unity, and you have to consider how to properly expose those values. And this is one example. You split up the logic and the data, and that's a very common thing to do. It's just that a lot of people don't think about it, including me. Oftentimes, I'll accidentally write myself into a corner without meaning to. Another thing to think about when you're talking about containing and listing things, what if you wanted to do something like a multiplayer game? You want to be able to contain something like the player stats so that they don't get transmitted every frame to every person. You only want to transmit specific important details, right? So the server keeps a list of all the player stats, and then the clients don't. They just have position and velocity and stuff, right? That's another thing. What we've done is we've scoped it. We've scoped some of that stuff to server only, some of that stuff to client and server. And then you might have stuff that's only client, like the visuals. So by scoping these things correctly, you can make sure that you understand who is responsible for what, and also make sure that you don't accidentally make things too entangled. Because if you are transmitting stats every frame, then you'll suddenly figure out that you have to stop doing that, or you'll end up transmitting megabytes a second, and oh no, now it's going to be really, really annoying to go back and detangle that nonsense. If you think about scope ahead of time, you can lessen those problems. And if you do have those problems, thinking about scope can often help you fix them. How about creating variants? Well, we've already discussed this to some extent. This enemy spawner is a fun example, but we'll go ahead and give you an easier example. Let's say that these zombies are in the game and you want to make one of them a super zombie, or you want to make one of them drop a special item, right? So what you normally do is you might have a zombies prefab or a zombies scriptable object, right? A lot of people have been told to use scriptable objects for their enemy lists, and I'm going to show you why that is not a great idea right now. Because this zombie scriptable object can never be instantiated. There's only one instance of it in the entire project. And then what you've got is you've got like a live enemy class here. And the live enemy class points to the zombie, and then it just keeps track of like damage done and what sprite to display and that sort of stuff. So the live enemy is responsible just for keeping track of the details of the ongoing simulation, whereas the zombie scriptable object is responsible for keeping track of all of the stats. This is how RPG Maker does it. It's got a database, and it's basically the same setup, right? The problem is, what if we want to create a zombie variant? Well, if we create a zombie variant and we're using scriptable objects or a database, then we have to create a zombie variant. We have to permanently save a variant into our code base. And now we're gumming up our code base with a zombie 01 variant that's only used in one scene and is permanently on the list of things, even though it's never going to be used again. And if someone accidentally uses it, they may find that its stats change randomly. So as someone else, someone else tweaks the stats where it's supposed to be. So the better approach, in my opinion, is to use prefabs and spawn in the prefabs. So the zombie prefab is simply a prefab, and when you spawn it in, it becomes an instance of zombie. And this is like the obvious thing to do, and this is a lot of people have been warned away from doing this, and I have no idea why, because it's extremely easy and powerful. If we drop a zombie into the scene, we can create a zombie variant simply by editing the zombie that's in the scene and then not hitting apply. And that means that it's the only zombie with those stats. This is especially important if you're planning to create events, because the scriptable object zombie can't have any meaningful Unity events that can be tweaked in any meaningful way. So, for example, our zombie, if we have an enemy class, our enemy class can have a couple of events. It can have an on harm, on deals damage, whatever you want to call it, an on die, on take damage, that sort of stuff, right? And these are Unity events, so they're exposed at every level we need them to be exposed at. They're global, they're prefab, they're local, they're tweaked prefab. So we can have these do whatever we want to do. So maybe our zombie on deals damaged, this fires a steal health event, right? So now all zombies that are spawned into the game will have this steal health event, where wherever they damage you, whenever they damage anybody, they steal some health. It's a very, very basic setup, and it uses the Unity event on a global level. So the prefab has been set up to steal health. But we want these zombies to light you on fire if they bite you. Instead of going and creating a fire-breathing zombie variant, because this is the only time we're going to need this fire-breathing zombie, what we do instead is we just, for this zombie in specific, we take this and we put it in the game world. There we are. Like so. And we just remove the steal health option, and instead we add in a light on fire option. And it just works. It just runs. It instantly just runs. We can even add an on damaged where they explode violently. If we want to later introduce this fire-breathing exploding zombie as a permanent member of our cast, we can just drop it in as a new prefab, and there it is. It's now a new prefab that can be used in any scene. So this is a really powerful method to let you customize at any scope and create variants at any scope. You can create tutorials like this too. So whether we're talking about scripting a level or scripting a tutorial, that's not it. You can do it using the proper scoping. And this keeps your games light. You no longer have a ton of global code that references local stuff. It doesn't have to anymore. Instead, it does very, very gentle link-ups using Unity events or other sorts of soft links and references. And I think that this is what I was trying to say in my last video, and I didn't say it very well. And I hope this says it better. Let me know if you have any questions, although I may not answer them for the next couple of weeks because I'll be busy. But hopefully I'll see you around. Have a good one. Well, that's not it. That's creating a starry folder. There's the stop recording.